She thought her cruelty would stay hidden and no one would ever know the truth. Every day, the girl stayed silent, enduring the abuse. But one day, the parents noticed something they couldn't ignore. And from that moment, the nanny's life began to crumble. What happens when the truth finally comes to light? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And tell us, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below. The sun was already beginning to sink beneath the horizon, casting long golden shadows over the well-kept lawns of the suburban neighborhood where Layla lived. To anyone passing by, her family appeared to be the embodiment of success: a spacious house, luxury cars parked in the driveway, and a life seemingly free from care. But as the evening settled in, the truth within the walls of this house began to contrast sharply with its outward appearance. Layla's father, Richard Thomas, was a man who had built his life from the ground up. He was the CEO of a thriving tech company and prided himself on providing his family with everything they needed. A tall man with a commanding presence, he spent long hours at the office, his mind constantly preoccupied with meetings, deals, and expansion strategies. He wasn't an absent father, but his time with Layla was often reduced to fleeting moments: a kiss on the forehead in the morning before he left for work, or a quick dinner before diving back into his emails. Layla's mother, Simone, was equally successful. As a prominent attorney, she was known for her tenacity in the courtroom and her ability to navigate complex legal cases. However, much like her husband, Simone was often away on business, working long hours to maintain her position in the firm. Though Simone tried to balance her career with motherhood, her attention was often scattered, leaving her to rely heavily on others to help care for their daughter. In many ways, Layla was a reflection of her parents' achievements. At just 7 years old, she was a bright and curious child, excelling in her studies and always eager to learn. Her bedroom was a testament to her interests: shelves lined with books on a variety of topics, a desk cluttered with half-finished projects, and walls adorned with colorful artwork she had created. Yet, despite all the material comforts surrounding her, there was a growing emptiness in her young heart, a void that neither toys nor achievements could fill. For the past year, the Thomases had entrusted Layla's care to a live-in nanny, Marjorie. She had come highly recommended, with glowing references from other families who praised her ability to handle even the most challenging children. To Richard and Simone, Marjorie seemed perfect: efficient, polite, and always punctual. They were convinced that under her care, Layla was in good hands, safe and well taken care of. But beneath Marjorie's polished exterior lay a different person. In the presence of Richard and Simone, she maintained the facade of the perfect nanny, speaking softly and affectionately to Layla, performing her duties with the utmost professionalism. She ensured Layla's schoolwork was done, that meals were served on time, and that the house remained orderly. On the surface, there was nothing to suspect. Layla, however, saw a different side of Marjorie, a side that remained hidden from her parents. When Richard and Simone left for work each morning, Marjorie's demeanor would change. She would grow cold, her voice sharp and condescending. Layla, once full of life and curiosity, began to shrink under her gaze. The little girl, who once filled the house with laughter, now walked on eggshells, terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing. At first, it was the small things. Marjorie would give Layla menial tasks to complete, such as cleaning up after herself or folding laundry, chores that seemed harmless enough but were often accompanied by biting remarks about how lazy or spoiled she was. When Layla asked for help with her homework, Marjorie would brush her off, saying, "Figure it out yourself. You can't expect people to do everything for you." Over time, the insults grew harsher. Marjorie began mocking Layla for her appearance, criticizing her hair, her skin, and the way she spoke. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she would sneer. "But you're just like the rest of them. You'll never be good enough." Layla didn't understand what Marjorie meant, but the words stung nonetheless, leaving her feeling confused and hurt. Layla's natural instinct was to tell her parents, but each time she thought about it, fear gripped her. What if they didn't believe her? Marjorie had already planted that seed of doubt in her mind. "Your parents, trust me," she had whispered one night after tucking Layla into bed. "They won't believe a word you say. They think I'm wonderful, and you, well, you're just a child." Richard and Simone, consumed by their careers, noticed only subtle changes in their daughter's behavior. Layla had become more withdrawn, her once constant stream of questions reduced to quiet nods and polite responses. She no longer ran to greet her father at the door or begged her mother to read her stories at night. Instead, she spent her time alone in her room, keeping her thoughts and feelings bottled up inside. Simone had chalked it up to Layla growing older, assuming that her daughter was simply becoming more independent. "She's probably just going through a phase," she would tell Richard. "Kids do that, you know. She'll come around." Richard, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had caught Layla staring off into the distance more than once, her eyes clouded with a sadness he didn't understand. He had asked her about it, but Layla, terrified of the consequences, would force a smile and assure him that everything was fine. Marjorie was always quick to step in during these moments, diverting attention away from Layla's unease with a well-timed comment or a diversion. "Layla's been doing wonderfully at school," she would say. "She's just a bit tired from all her studies. Nothing to worry about." And, for a while, Richard had allowed himself to be convinced. But Layla's heart told a different story. The more Marjorie's cruelty grew, the more isolated Layla became. She stopped confiding in her parents altogether, convinced that they were too busy or too blind to see what was happening right under their noses. Each night, as she lay in bed, she would listen for the sound of the front door, hoping that her father's footsteps would come upstairs so she could tell him everything. But those footsteps never came. In moments of desperation, Layla would retreat into her imagination. She would picture herself standing tall in front of her parents, bravely recounting all the terrible things Marjorie had said and done. She imagined their shock, their outrage, and, most importantly, their belief in her. But when the morning came, the fear returned, and she remained silent. As the weeks went by, the tension in the house grew, unnoticed by Richard and Simone. Marjorie continued to play her part flawlessly, earning their trust and admiration while tormenting Layla behind closed doors, and Layla, trapped in her own fear and confusion, felt more alone than ever. The only person who seemed to notice that something was wrong was Layla's teacher, Mrs. Stevens. A kind woman with a sharp intuition, she had seen the light in Layla's eyes dim over the past few months. Once a lively and eager student, Layla now sat quietly in the back of the classroom, her hand rarely raised, her smile barely visible. After class one afternoon, Mrs. Stevens pulled Layla aside. "Is everything all right, Layla?" she asked gently. "You don't seem like yourself lately." Layla hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to tell Mrs. Stevens everything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she forced a small smile and nodded. "I'm fine," she whispered, but Mrs. Stevens wasn't convinced. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Remember that, okay?" Layla nodded again, but deep down she knew that no one could help her, not until she found the courage to speak the truth. As the evening came to a close, Layla sat by her bedroom window, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the horizon. The house was quiet, but within her a storm was brewing. She knew that sooner or later something would have to change. But for now, all she could do was wait. The house felt different when Layla's parents were gone. The warmth and comfort she associated with home evaporated the moment the front door clicked shut behind them, leaving behind a cold, empty space filled with silence. As Richard and Simone's car disappeared down the driveway, the last traces of safety seemed to vanish with it. The shift in Marjorie's demeanor was almost immediate, as if a switch had been flipped. The kind and nurturing Nanny her parents knew became someone entirely different, cruel, manipulative, and frightening. Today was no exception. The instant the door closed, Marjorie, who had been smiling softly moments earlier, turned to Layla with a harsh look in her eyes. Her lips curled into a sneer as she placed her hands on her hips, towering over the small girl who sat at the kitchen table, quietly coloring. "Don't you have something better to do than sitting there scribbling like a fool?" Marjorie's voice dripped with disdain. "Honestly, you act like a baby." Layla tensed, her fingers tightening around the crayon in her hand. She didn't dare respond. Experience had taught her that nothing she said would make a difference. Silence was her safest bet. Marjorie moved closer, standing right behind Layla now, looking over her shoulder at the drawing. "What is this supposed to be anyway?" She reached down, snatching the paper from the table and crumpling it in her hands. "A waste of time, just like everything else you do." The sting of those words cut through Layla's heart, but she remained quiet, lowering her head so that Marjorie wouldn't see the tears that were already beginning to form in her eyes. It wasn't the first time Marjorie had ridiculed her, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Layla had learned to brace herself for the insults and the scorn, but no matter how many times it happened, it still hurt. Without another word, Marjorie tossed the crumpled drawing into the trash and turned to face Layla again. "Get up," she ordered. "You're going to clean up this mess in the kitchen. Your mother might think you're a princess, but you'll learn soon enough that no one is going to clean up after you forever." Layla didn't protest. She simply stood up, her small frame moving towards the sink where a pile of dishes had accumulated from the breakfast she and Marjorie had shared earlier. As she began rinsing them, her hands shaking slightly, she could feel Marjorie's gaze burning into the back of her head. This was how it always was when her parents were gone. Marjorie found ways to belittle her, to make her feel insignificant, unworthy. She gave her tasks that seemed impossible for someone so young: cleaning, organizing, and even scrubbing the floors. And if Layla dared to resist or failed to meet Marjorie's impossible standards, the consequences were swift and severe. "You're so useless," Marjorie muttered as she passed by Layla, bumping her shoulder hard enough to make the young girl almost lose her balance. "No wonder your parents can't stand to be around you." That statement struck harder than any physical blow. Layla's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she felt as though the weight of those words might crush her. Could it be true? Did her parents really not want to be around her? Is that why they worked so much, leaving her behind? She pushed the thought away, refusing to believe it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. As she scrubbed at the dishes, Marjorie's voice continued in the background, a constant stream of verbal abuse that gnawed away at Layla's spirit. The once bubbly and talkative girl had been reduced to near silence, her voice no longer rising in the house, unless it was a hushed response to Marjorie's demands. But the abuse wasn't just verbal. Marjorie's temper had grown more volatile over the months, and when Layla wasn't quick enough to respond or didn't complete her tasks to Marjorie's satisfaction, the punishment could be physical. It started with sharp pinches on her arm, a shove here or there, but soon the aggression escalated. One day, Layla had accidentally spilled juice on the kitchen floor. The moment the liquid splashed onto the tiles, she froze, knowing what was coming. Marjorie stormed into the kitchen, her eyes blazing with fury. "Look what you've done," she screamed, grabbing Layla by the arm and shaking her. "You're nothing but a clumsy little brat. Do you even know how hard it is to clean up after you?" Layla's heart raced as she tried to stammer out an apology, but Marjorie wasn't interested in apologies. She yanked Layla down to the floor, forcing the girl to her knees in front of the mess. "Clean it up, now!" she barked, her grip on Layla's arm tightening painfully. Layla winced but didn't dare cry out. She hurriedly grabbed a towel and began mopping up the spilled juice, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the cloth. After the mess was cleaned, Marjorie released her arm with a rough shove. Layla scrambled to her feet, rubbing the sore spot where Marjorie had gripped her, and retreated to her bedroom as quickly as she could. She knew better than to stay in Marjorie's presence any longer than necessary. That night, as she lay in bed, the dark thoughts began to creep in again. She wondered if this was her fault, if she really was as useless as Marjorie said. She thought about telling her parents, about the yelling, the hitting, the cruel words. But every time she considered it, Marjorie's threats echoed in her mind. "Your parents trust me. They won't believe you. And even if they do, what do you think will happen? They'll be so angry that you've caused problems, they'll send you away to some boarding school, and you'll never see them again. Is that what you want?" The fear of being sent away, of being blamed for causing trouble, was too much for Layla to bear. So she kept quiet, holding the pain inside as best she could, but her body began betraying her silence. She started to lose her appetite, pushing food around her plate during meals and excusing herself early from the table. Her once clear skin now bore the occasional bruise, faint enough to pass unnoticed but enough to remind Layla of her daily reality. She grew more withdrawn at school, no longer participating in class discussions or playing with friends during recess. One day, her teacher, Mrs. Stevens, noticed Layla sitting alone on the playground, her face solemn and distant. Mrs. Stevens approached her, sitting down on the bench beside her. "Layla, sweetie, is everything all right?" Mrs. Stevens asked softly, her voice full of concern. Layla looked up, startled, her eyes wide. She nodded quickly, too afraid to say anything, but Mrs. Stevens wasn't convinced. "You don't seem like yourself lately," the teacher pressed gently. "If there's something bothering you, you can talk to me. You know that, right?" Layla swallowed hard, biting back the words that threatened to spill out. She wanted to tell Mrs. Stevens everything, to explain how awful things had become at home when her parents weren't around, but she couldn't. The fear of Marjorie's threats loomed large in her mind, so she simply nodded again and mumbled, "I'm fine." Mrs. Stevens watched her for a moment longer, her brow furrowed in concern. But she didn't push further, not wanting to upset the girl. Instead, she gave Layla a small smile. "All right, but if you ever need to talk, I'm here for you. Remember that." Layla nodded again, but as she watched Mrs. Stevens walk away, she felt more isolated than ever. No one could help her. Not her teacher, not her friends, and certainly not her parents, who were too busy to notice what was happening right in front of them. The days blurred together, each one filled with more of the same cruelty and fear. Marjorie's control over Layla tightened with each passing week. The nanny became more demanding, more aggressive, and the bruises, both physical and emotional, began to pile up. Layla felt like she was sinking into a pit she couldn't escape from, but deep down, she knew that she couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give. Either Marjorie's torment would destroy her, or Layla would have to find the courage to fight back. The only question was when. Layla sat in her room, staring at the pages of her notebook, the pencil in her hand moving absent-mindedly across the paper. Outside, the birds chirped in the distance. The sound of lawnmowers hummed faintly, and children's laughter echoed from the nearby park. But in her small world, those sounds felt far away, unreachable. The weight of her secret had grown too heavy for her to carry alone, and it pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had tried so hard to be brave. She had tried to tell herself that she could handle Marjorie's cruelty, that if she just stayed quiet and did what she was told, things would eventually get better. But every day, the taunts, the insults, and the occasional bruises only seemed to get worse. And now, with her father and mother too busy to notice anything unusual, Layla felt trapped. The little voice inside her head, the one that urged her to speak up, was growing louder with each passing day. But each time she came close to saying something, Marjorie's threats echoed in her mind. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room, Layla found herself thinking about her father again. She pictured his face, the way he smiled at her when he had the time, and the way he always called her his brave girl. Would he still think she was brave if he knew how scared she was all the time? Could she really tell him what was happening? She bit her lip, remembering all the moments when she had almost said something but stopped herself at the last second. Once, she had stood in the doorway of his office, her heart racing as she opened her mouth to speak, only for Marjorie to appear behind her, silently shaking her head with a cold, warning glance. Layla had turned away, muttering an excuse about needing help with her homework. Another time, she had sat at the dinner table, her father's question hanging in the air. "How was your day, sweetie?" She had nearly blurted it out then, nearly told him that every day was awful, that she was scared to be alone with Marjorie. But the words stuck in her throat, and she said nothing. Her mother, too, had noticed that something was different. A few nights ago, Simone had come into Layla's room before bed, sitting down beside her on the edge of the bed. "You've been so quiet lately, darling," she had said, brushing a strand of hair from Layla's forehead. "Is everything okay?" Layla had wanted to tell her everything. The words had danced on the tip of her tongue, her lips had even parted to speak. But then the familiar fear returned, and she simply shook her head. "I'm just tired, Mommy," she had whispered instead. Her mother had kissed her good night, her brow furrowed in concern, but too tired herself to push further. And so the days passed, and Layla's silence grew heavier, making her feel smaller and more insignificant with each passing moment. But now, as she sat alone in her room, the decision weighed heavily on her shoulders. She knew she couldn't keep hiding the truth. The next time her father asked, the next time her mother checked in on her, she had to say something. She had to find the courage. That evening, as her father returned home from work, Layla felt a spark of hope flicker in her chest. She sat at the dinner table, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the right moment. Her father, tired from a long day, glanced up from his phone briefly and smiled at her. "How was your day, sweetie?" he asked, his voice kind but distracted. This was her chance. Layla swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her ears. She could feel the words bubbling up inside her, and for a brief moment, she believed that this time she could do it. This time, she could tell him the truth. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, she felt Marjorie's eyes on her from across the room. The nanny stood near the kitchen doorway, pretending to clean up, but her gaze was fixed on Layla, a silent warning in her eyes. Layla's throat tightened, and the words died on her tongue. She looked down at her plate, her hands trembling slightly as she forced a smile. "It was fine," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father nodded absent-mindedly and returned his attention to his phone, completely unaware of the battle that had just taken place inside his daughter's heart. Layla felt a wave of disappointment wash over her, the familiar sense of failure settling in her stomach. She had come so close, and yet, once again, she had let fear win. Later that night, after her parents had gone to bed, Layla lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened if she had told the truth, if she had been brave enough to defy Marjorie's threats. Would her father have believed her? Would her mother have protected her? Or would Marjorie have found a way to twist the truth, making Layla look like the one causing problems? The uncertainty gnawed at her, keeping her awake long after the house had fallen silent. The next day at school, Layla's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Stevens had grown increasingly concerned over the past few weeks. The once vibrant and eager student was now quiet, withdrawn, and her work had begun to slip. Layla, who had always been one of the top students in her class, now sat in the back, barely participating. Mrs. Stevens watched Layla from her desk, noting how the little girl kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with her classmates and teachers alike. Something wasn't right, and Mrs. Stevens could sense it. After class that afternoon, she decided to talk to Layla privately. As the other children rushed out of the room, eager to start their weekend, Mrs. Stevens gently placed a hand on Layla's shoulder, stopping her from leaving. "Layla, could I talk to you for a minute?" she asked, her voice calm and kind. Layla froze, her heart racing as she nodded slowly. She followed Mrs. Stevens to the front of the classroom where the teacher knelt down to be at eye level with her. "I've noticed you've been a little quieter than usual," Mrs. Stevens said gently. "Is everything all right? You know, you can talk to me if something's bothering you." For a brief moment, Layla considered it. She thought about telling Mrs. Stevens the truth, about confessing everything that had been happening at home with Marjorie. But then, just as quickly as the thought appeared, the fear returned. What if Mrs. Stevens didn't believe her? What if she told her parents, and they didn't believe her either? What if Marjorie found out and made things even worse? Layla shook her head, forcing a smile as she hugged her backpack tighter. "I'm fine, Mrs. Stevens," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Stevens studied her for a moment, concern etched on her face. She could tell that something was wrong, but she didn't want to push Layla too hard. "All right," she said softly, "but remember, I'm always here if you need to talk." Layla nodded and quickly hurried out of the classroom, relief and guilt swirling inside her. She had lied again. She had let another opportunity slip away. That evening, as Layla sat at the dinner table once more, she felt the weight of her silence growing heavier. Her father was talking about his day, his voice animated as he described a meeting with an important client. Layla barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the never-ending cycle of fear and indecision. She knew she couldn't keep going like this. The next time her father asked how her day was, the next time her mother looked at her with concern, she had to say something. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. The decision had been made, even if the words still refused to come. Layla would find the courage. She had to. It was the only way to stop the nightmare that her life had become. But for now, she remained quiet, waiting for the right moment, hoping that when it came, she would finally be brave enough to speak. Layla's day began like any other, with the same dull ache in her chest that had settled there long ago. She sat at the breakfast table, slowly spooning cereal into her mouth, her appetite long gone. Across from her, Marjorie sipped her coffee, her eyes cold and calculating. Richard and Simone had already left for the day, their absence leaving the house eerily quiet, and Layla knew that today would be another endless stretch of torment. The morning passed in a blur of commands and insults. Marjorie gave her chores that seemed deliberately designed to make her fail. Tasks like folding laundry perfectly or organizing bookshelves by author and genre, knowing full well that any mistake would result in scorn. Each time Layla tried her best, Marjorie would find a reason to call her efforts inadequate. Useless, Marjorie muttered under her breath as Layla struggled to fold a sheet. Can't even do the simplest things right. By noon, Layla's small hands ached from scrubbing the kitchen floor. She fought back tears as Marjorie hovered behind her, watching with a critical eye. Missed a spot, the nanny said sharply, pointing at a non-existent stain on the tiles. Layla wiped the area again, though she knew it wouldn't matter. Marjorie would always find something to criticize. Then it happened. Layla accidentally knocked over a glass of juice while reaching for the sponge. The glass hit the floor, shattering into pieces, and the bright orange liquid spread across the tiles like a warning beacon. For a moment, everything was still. Layla stared at the mess, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Marjorie's face twisted with fury, her hands clenching into fists. "You stupid, clumsy little brat," she shouted, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. Before Layla could react, Marjorie's hand shot out, striking her hard across the cheek. The force of the blow sent Layla stumbling backward, her small body colliding with the kitchen counter. She cried out in pain, clutching her face as tears welled up in her eyes. The room seemed to spin around her, and for a moment, all she could hear was the rushing of blood in her ears. She tasted copper on her tongue and realized her lip had been split from the impact. Marjorie loomed over her, her expression a mixture of rage and satisfaction. "Maybe now you'll learn to be more careful," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. Layla sat on the floor, her hands shaking as she wiped away the tears that streamed down her face. The pain in her cheek was nothing compared to the humiliation that burned deep in her chest. She had never felt so small, so helpless. Something inside her broke in that moment, something that had been held together by fear and silence for far too long. The little voice in her head, the one that had always told her to stay quiet, was drowned out by a new voice, one that whispered, "No more." She knew then that she couldn't keep living like this. No matter what Marjorie said, no matter how scared she was, Layla knew that she had to tell her parents the truth. She couldn't endure another day of cruelty and fear. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it was anything but. For the first time in months, Layla felt a flicker of determination ignite within her. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her shirt, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Marjorie sneered down at her, oblivious to the shift happening inside the little girl she had spent so long tormenting. "Get up and clean this mess," she snapped. "And if you think about telling your parents anything, remember what I told you. No one will believe you. You'll only make things worse for yourself." But this time the words didn't have the same power over Layla. The fear that had kept her silent for so long was slowly being replaced by something stronger, a quiet, unwavering resolve. That evening, when Richard came home from work, Layla waited for her moment. Her cheek still throbbed from the slap, and she knew the bruise would be visible by morning. But she no longer cared about hiding it. If her parents couldn't see the truth for themselves, she would show them. When her father finally sat down at the dinner table, exhausted from a long day, Layla took a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists beneath the table to keep them steady. "Daddy," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Richard glanced up from his plate, his brow furrowed in concern. "What is it, sweetie?" For a moment, Layla hesitated. The familiar fear bubbled up inside her, threatening to choke her words before they could escape. But then she remembered the slap, the shattered glass, the cold, hateful look in Marjorie's eyes, and she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. "It's Marjorie," Layla whispered, her voice trembling but determined. She hurts me, Daddy. When you and Mommy aren't home, she yells at me and hits me." The room fell into stunned silence. Richard stared at his daughter, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What?" he said softly, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. Layla's heart pounded in her chest, but she pressed on. "She hit me today," she said, lifting her hand to show him the swollen, reddened bruise on her cheek. "She says mean things, too. Really mean things." Richard's face darkened with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Why didn't you tell us sooner, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice strained with emotion. "I was scared," Layla admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "She said you wouldn't believe me. She said you'd be mad at me if I told you." Richard's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists on the table. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Marjorie was cleaning up, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. Without another word, Richard stood from the table, his expression hard and unreadable. Layla watched as her father crossed the room in a few quick strides, his movements sharp with anger. "Marjorie!" he barked, his voice loud and commanding. The nanny turned, startled by the sudden shift in Richard's demeanor. "Yes, Mr. Thomas," she said, her tone polite but wary. Richard's eyes burned with fury as he pointed to Layla's bruised cheek. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice dangerously low. Marjorie's expression faltered for a split second before she composed herself. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she said smoothly. "Layla must have hurt herself playing. She's always so clumsy." Layla felt a knot of anger and frustration tighten in her chest. The lies were coming so easily to Marjorie, just as they always did. But this time, Layla wasn't going to let her get away with it. "That's not true," Layla cried, her voice rising with desperation. "She hit me. She always hits me when you're not here." Richard turned back to Marjorie, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice cold and unforgiving. Before Marjorie could respond, the doorbell rang. Richard hesitated for a moment, then turned toward the front door. "Stay here," he said sternly, pointing at Marjorie before striding out of the room to answer the door. As Layla sat at the table, her heart still pounding from the confrontation, she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she had spoken the truth. And no matter what happened next, she knew she had made the right choice. The tension in the house was thick, almost suffocating. Layla sat at the dining room table, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She could hear her father's heavy footsteps moving towards the front door, leaving a momentary silence between her and Marjorie, who now stood frozen in place. For once, the confident, cruel smirk on Marjorie's face was gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. Layla clenched her hands in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. The slap from earlier still stung on her cheek, but it was nothing compared to the emotional weight that had been lifted. For the first time in months, she had told the truth. Now it was up to her parents to believe her. When the front door opened, Layla strained to hear the voices outside. There was a brief exchange, and then the door closed again, followed by more footsteps. But this time, Layla's mother, Simone, appeared at the entrance to the dining room. Her face was etched with confusion, clearly having just returned from an unexpected call home. Layla hadn't expected her mother to be part of this moment, but now that she was here, it felt like fate had intervened. "What's going on?" Simone asked, her sharp gaze moving between Layla and Marjorie, immediately sensing the tension in the room. Layla's throat tightened again, the familiar fear creeping back, but she held her ground. She had already taken the first step. There was no going back now. Her mother needed to hear the truth, too. Richard re-entered the room behind Simone, his face set in grim determination. He exchanged a quick glance with his wife before turning back to Marjorie, who was standing stiffly by the kitchen counter. "Layla just told us something very concerning," Richard began, his voice steady but laced with anger. "She says you've been hurting her, Marjorie." Simone's eyes widened in shock, her attention snapping to her daughter. "What?" she gasped, her voice trembling slightly. She crouched down beside Layla, her hands gently cupping the little girl's face. "Sweetheart, is this true?" Layla nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. "She hit me today, Mommy," Layla whispered, her voice fragile but unwavering. "And she's been saying mean things to me for a long time. Things that make me feel bad." Simone's face paled as she carefully traced the bruise on Layla's cheek with her fingers, her hands shaking slightly. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" she asked softly, her voice heavy with a mixture of concern and guilt. "I was scared," Layla admitted, glancing nervously at Marjorie, who remained silent but visibly tense. "She said you wouldn't believe me, and that you'd be mad if I caused problems." Simone looked as if someone had slapped her, the weight of her daughter's words hitting her hard. She slowly stood up, turning toward Marjorie, disbelief and fury building in her eyes. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice shaken with barely controlled anger. "How dare you hurt my daughter?" Marjorie, who had been standing in stunned silence until now, finally found her voice. "Mrs. Thomas, I assure you, there's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said quickly, her usual smooth tone faltering as she tried to regain control. "Layla's just a child. You know how imaginative children can be. I would never—" "Enough," Richard interrupted, his voice cold and sharp. He took a step forward, his imposing figure looming over Marjorie. "I saw the bruise on my daughter's face. I've heard what she said. You don't get to explain this away." Panic flashed across Marjorie's face for the briefest of moments, but she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice turning defensive. "I've done nothing but take care of Layla the way I've always been asked to. I've treated her the way any responsible nanny would. If she's upset because I've been firm with her, that's on her. You can't seriously believe that Simone's voice cut through Marjorie's tirade like a knife. "Leave my house, now." Marjorie blinked, momentarily stunned into silence. "You're firing me? Just like that?" she asked, her voice incredulous. "Based on the word of a child?" Richard stepped forward again, his jaw clenched. "Yes, based on the word of my daughter, whom I trust far more than someone who would lay a hand on her." His voice was low but dangerous, the fury in his eyes unmistakable. Marjorie opened her mouth to protest again, but the look on Simone's face stopped her cold. "You heard my husband," Simone said, her voice steely. "Pack your things and go. I'll be contacting the agency to let them know exactly what you've done." For a moment, Marjorie stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and anger. She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly realizing that she had lost this battle. Without another word, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing loudly through the house as she made her way to her quarters to gather her belongings. As the sound of Marjorie's retreat faded, the house fell into an uneasy silence. Layla remained at the table, her hands trembling slightly, unable to fully process what had just happened. Her parents had believed her. Marjorie was gone. The nightmare she had lived through for so long was finally over. But instead of relief, Layla felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. Fear, guilt, and even a sense of disbelief. It all felt so sudden, so surreal. Simone knelt down beside Layla again, pulling her daughter into a gentle embrace. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we didn't notice sooner." Layla buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her tears finally breaking free. "I tried to tell you before," she sobbed quietly, "but I was too scared." Simone held her tightly, her own tears silently spilling down her cheeks. "I know, sweetheart, I know. But it's over now. You're safe." Richard joined them, kneeling down beside his wife and daughter, his strong arms wrapping around both of them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Layla felt the weight of her fear begin to lift. Her parents were here. They had believed her, and they weren't going to let anything like this happen again. After what felt like an eternity, Simone gently pulled back, wiping the tears from her daughter's face. "We'll make sure she's held accountable for what she's done," she promised, her voice filled with quiet determination. "This isn't over." Richard nodded in agreement, his jaw still clenched with anger. "We'll file a report with the police," he said firmly, "and I'll be calling the agency first thing in the morning. She'll never work as a nanny again." Layla sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Will I have to talk to the police?" she asked softly, her voice trembling at the thought of facing more adults who might not believe her. Simone brushed Layla's hair back, offering her a gentle smile. "You'll only have to say what you're comfortable with, sweetheart. We'll be with you the whole time." Layla nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew that as long as her parents were by her side, she could face whatever came next. As the evening wore on, the house began to feel different, lighter somehow. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it for so long was finally lifting, replaced by a sense of hope. Layla knew there were still challenges ahead, that there would be difficult conversations and painful memories to face, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't facing them alone. Her parents were with her now, and together they would make sure that justice was served. The days following Marjorie's departure were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult conversations. Layla's parents wasted no time taking action. Richard contacted the police, and Simone, using her legal expertise, filed a formal report documenting every instance of abuse Layla had described. They knew it wouldn't be an easy process, but they were determined to ensure Marjorie faced consequences for her actions. The next morning, a detective arrived at the house to interview Layla. Simone sat beside her daughter, holding her hand gently, while Richard stood nearby, his presence reassuring. The detective, a woman with kind eyes, knelt to Layla's level, speaking in a soft voice to make her feel comfortable. "You're very brave for telling the truth, Layla," the detective said. "I know it's hard to talk about these things, but we need to understand what happened so we can help." Layla's voice trembled as she recounted the details of Marjorie's abuse, the insults, the threats, the hitting. She described the slap that left the bruise on her cheek and the fear that kept her silent for so long. The detective listened patiently, taking notes but never interrupting. When Layla finished, she offered the girl a small smile. "You did the right thing by speaking up," the detective said. "We're going to make sure Marjorie is held accountable for what she did." The police opened an investigation, and Simone used her professional connections to ensure that the case received the attention it deserved. She knew from experience how difficult it could be to hold people like Marjorie accountable, especially when they had a history of escaping consequences. But this time, Marjorie's past would catch up with her. It didn't take long for the story to attract public attention. News outlets picked up the case, highlighting the abuse and the legal actions the Thomases were pursuing. The media focused not only on Marjorie's behavior, but also on the racial undertones that had motivated her actions. Journalists delved into Marjorie's past, uncovering disturbing patterns of mistreatment toward other black children in previous jobs. The public response was swift and intense. Social media exploded with outrage, with hashtags like #JusticeForLayla trending within hours. People expressed anger and heartbreak, calling for accountability and raising awareness about the hidden dangers of domestic workers abusing their power. The story resonated with many, exposing a darker side of childcare that few were willing to talk about openly. Simone and Richard, though overwhelmed by the sudden media attention, knew it was important to keep the focus on Layla's well-being. They limited interviews and public appearances, only speaking to trusted outlets that promised to approach the story with care and sensitivity. Their priority was to protect their daughter from further trauma while ensuring that Marjorie faced the full weight of the law. In the midst of the growing public interest, another discovery emerged. Investigators found that Marjorie's pattern of abuse stretched back years. Former employers came forward, recounting stories eerily similar to Layla's. Families shared how Marjorie had subtly manipulated them, keeping them unaware of the cruelty she inflicted on their children. Some admitted they had ignored warning signs, while others had dismissed their children's complaints as mere misunderstandings. The weight of these revelations only strengthened the Thomases' resolve. They were no longer fighting just for Layla. They were fighting for every child who had suffered in silence under Marjorie's care. Richard and Simone knew that they had to set a precedent to ensure that no child would ever endure what Layla had experienced. The trial date was set, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators eager to follow the high-profile case. Layla, dressed in her best outfit and holding her mother's hand tightly, walked into the courtroom with her head held high. She was nervous, terrified even, but she knew that she had to be strong. On the witness stand, Layla spoke with quiet courage, recounting her experiences in front of the judge and jury. Her voice wavered at times, but she didn't falter. The presence of her parents, sitting in the front row, gave her the strength to keep going. As she described the abuse she endured, the courtroom fell silent. the gravity of her words sinking in. Marjorie sat across the room, her expression cold and unrepentant. She had hired an attorney who tried to paint Layla's accusations as exaggerated or misunderstood, but the overwhelming evidence and the testimony from other families made it impossible to ignore the truth. One by one, former employers took the stand, confirming that Marjorie had abused their children as well. The jury listened intently as parents described their regret for not acting sooner, their voices heavy with guilt. It was clear that Marjorie's actions had left a trail of pain and suffering, spanning years and affecting multiple families. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom held its breath, waiting for the defense's final attempt to shift the narrative. But Marjorie's lawyers struggled to counter the powerful testimony that had already been presented. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury could see through the flimsy arguments the defense tried to make. After several days of testimony, the trial came to an end, and the jury deliberated. The room was tense with anticipation as the judge called the court to order for the final verdict. Layla sat between her parents, her small hands clenched in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty on all counts. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Richard wrapped his arm around Layla, pulling her close, while Simone leaned down to kiss the top of her daughter's head. Justice had been served. Marjorie was sentenced to several years in prison, and the judge's harsh words during sentencing made it clear that her actions were inexcusable. You abused the trust placed in you by these families, and you caused irreparable harm to vulnerable children, the judge stated firmly. This sentence serves not only as punishment, but as a warning to anyone who believes they can abuse their power with impunity. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause as the judge's gavel echoed through the chamber. Layla looked up at her parents, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It was over. The nightmare that had haunted her was finally behind her. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager to capture the moment. Simone, holding Layla's hand tightly, gave a brief statement to the press. "This case is not just about our family," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about every child who has suffered in silence. It's about holding people accountable and ensuring that no child ever has to endure what my daughter went through." Richard stood beside her, nodding in agreement. "We hope that this case serves as a reminder to everyone, parents, caregivers, and agencies alike, that trust must never be taken for granted. We owe it to our children to protect them, to listen to them, and to believe them." As the family walked away from the courthouse, Layla felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fear that had once consumed her was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but with her parents by her side, she felt ready to face whatever the future held. For the first time in a long time, Layla felt free. The trial might have ended, but the journey toward healing for Layla and her family was just beginning. In the weeks following the verdict, the Thomases worked together to rebuild the sense of safety that had been shattered by Marjorie's cruelty. Layla's parents, now fully aware of the cracks that had gone unnoticed in their busy lives, vowed never to let anything like this happen again. Richard took a step back from his demanding work schedule, determined to spend more time with his daughter. He traded late nights at the office for evenings at home, playing board games with Layla or reading her favorite bedtime stories. Layla, who had grown accustomed to his absence, slowly began to open up again, her laughter returning to the house like sunlight breaking through clouds. Simone also adjusted her routine, taking on fewer cases to be more present for her daughter. The guilt she carried for not recognizing the signs of abuse weighed heavily on her, but she knew that self-blame wouldn't help Layla heal. Instead, she focused on being a source of unwavering support, making sure Layla knew she could come to her with anything, no matter how small or difficult. Together, they sought out a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. Layla began attending weekly therapy sessions where she learned to express her feelings in a safe environment. At first, it was difficult for her to talk about what had happened. The memories of Marjorie's abuse were still fresh, and the fear of not being believed lingered in her mind. But as the sessions went on, Layla found her voice again. She talked about her sadness, her fear, and even the moments when she doubted her own worth. Her therapist helped her understand that none of what had happened was her fault. "You were brave for telling the truth," the therapist would remind her. "And bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing, even when you are." Over time, Layla's confidence grew. She began to participate more in school, raising her hand in class and joining her friends at recess. Mrs. Stevens, her teacher, noticed the change almost immediately and couldn't hide her joy when Layla greeted her one morning with a wide smile. At home, the changes were equally noticeable. Layla no longer felt the need to hide in her room or walk on eggshells. She laughed freely, asked questions at dinner, and eagerly shared stories about her day. Her relationship with her parents deepened as well. They no longer viewed her concerns as childish complaints, but listened carefully, validating her feelings and reassuring her that she was always heard. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Layla looked up at her parents with a question that had been on her mind for some time. "Do you think we could help other kids who went through the same thing?" she asked softly, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of a pillow. Richard and Simone exchanged a look, their hearts swelling with pride. Their daughter's resilience had inspired them, and they knew that Layla's story could make a difference in the lives of others. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart," Simone said, wrapping her arm around Layla's shoulders. "What do you think about starting a foundation to help kids who've experienced abuse and trauma?" Layla's eyes lit up. "Really? We can do that?" "We can," Richard confirmed with a warm smile. "And we will. We'll make sure every child has a place where they feel safe and supported." With Layla's enthusiastic input, the family launched the Brighter Futures Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping children heal from abuse and advocating for stricter oversight of caregivers. The foundation quickly gained momentum, attracting donations from individuals and companies who had followed Layla's story in the media. Simone took on the role of managing the foundation's legal initiatives, ensuring that caregivers like Marjorie could no longer slip through the cracks of the system. Richard used his business connections to raise funds and spread awareness, and Layla, in her own quiet way, became the heart of the foundation. She attended events, met with other children, and shared her story when she felt ready, offering hope to those who were still searching for their own courage. The foundation's work didn't go unnoticed. Media outlets followed its progress closely, praising the Thomases for turning their painful experience into something meaningful. Layla's story became a beacon of hope, inspiring other children to speak up and encouraging families to pay closer attention to the well-being of their loved ones. 1 year after Marjorie's sentencing, the Thomases held a special event to mark the official launch of the Brighter Futures Foundation. The event was held at a local community center filled with families, advocates, and supporters. Layla, dressed in a bright yellow dress that reflected her newfound happiness, stood on stage beside her parents, addressing the crowd for the first time. "I used to think that being scared meant I wasn't strong," Layla began, her voice steady but soft. "But I learned that being strong means doing the right thing, even when you're scared. And I want other kids to know that they're not alone, because someone will always listen." The audience erupted in applause, tears glimmering in many eyes. Simone and Richard couldn't have been prouder of their daughter, whose courage had not only changed their family, but had also made a difference in the lives of countless others. As the event came to an end, Layla stood with her parents, watching as children played together in the community center's courtyard. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Layla leaned against her father, feeling safe and content in a way she hadn't thought possible just a year ago. "Thank you for believing me," she whispered to her parents. Richard knelt down, wrapping his arms around her in a tight hug. "We'll always believe you, sweetheart," he said softly. "Always." Simone joined the embrace, her heart full as she kissed the top of Layla's head. "And we'll always be here for you, no matter what," she added. In that moment, surrounded by love and laughter, Layla knew that she had finally found peace. The darkness that had once clouded her life was gone, replaced by light, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. And this time, she wasn't afraid. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. There's always a new story waiting for you. Check out the next video or explore our channel for more inspiring content. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. See you in the next one.